Ever wondered about the mysterious staircases found deep in the forest? I work in the United States, in an area with untouched wilderness. I'm talking about hundreds of kilometers of dense forest, mountain ranges, and several lakes. There is still a great interest in stories about the mysterious staircases in the woods. Fortunately, my friend has a story on this topic that I think will intrigue all of you. I'll write a bit more about it at the end of this post. Have I thought about asking my superiors about these staircases? Yes, but I don't want to risk my job over such questions. However, one of my supervisors resigned and is no longer an officer in the search and rescue service, so perhaps he can talk to me about it. I'll talk to him later this week and let you know what comes of it. Now, let's get to some new stories. The first incident happened right after my training ended. I was still very inexperienced. Before starting to work, I had volunteered, so I had a general idea of what to expect. Typically, as a volunteer, you deal with calls to find missing people after experienced search and rescue officers have found their tracks. Working as a search and rescue officer, you handle entirely different calls, from animal bites to heart attacks. This call came early in the morning from a young couple on one of the trails leading to the lake. The husband was hysterical, and we couldn't understand what exactly had happened. In the background, we could hear the woman screaming, and the man was begging us to come to them as quickly as possible. When we arrived at the scene, we saw him holding his wife, who was clutching something in her hands. Her screams were animalistic, and he was sobbing. Seeing us, he started screaming for us to help him and call an ambulance. It was obvious that an ambulance couldn't drive on the pedestrian trail, so we asked if his wife needed assistance or if she could walk on her own. He was still hysterical, but he managed to explain that she didn't need medical help. While one of our veterans tried to calm him down, I approached his wife and asked what had happened. She was rocking back and forth, continuing to scream, holding something in her hands. I crouched down and saw that what she was holding was covered in blood, staining her clothes. That's when I noticed the sling on her chest, and my heart sank. I asked her again to tell me what had happened, and gently moved her hand to see what she was holding. It was her child, and he was dead. There was a dent in his head, and his body was covered in scratches. I had seen dead bodies before, but this situation shook me. I needed to collect myself, so I stood up and approached one of the veterans standing nearby. I told him that she was holding a dead child. He patted me on the shoulder and said he would handle it. It took us more than an hour to convince the woman to show us the child. Every time we tried to take him, she would jump to her feet and start telling us that he would be okay if we just left her alone and let her help him herself. Eventually, one of the veterans managed to calm her down, and she gave us the child. We took him to the trauma center. When we showed the body to the medics, they said there was no chance of saving him. He had died immediately after injuring his head. I had a good friend among the nurses, and she later told me what had happened. The couple had been walking with the child in a sling. They stopped because the child started to fuss. The father took the child in his arms, seeing a small ravine by the road. The mother approached them, but stepped on a piece of loose soil and slipped. She fell on her husband, who in turn dropped the child. The boy flew about 7 meters down and fell directly onto the rocks at the bottom of the ravine. The father climbed down and picked up the child, but he had already hit his head on the rocks and was dead. The baby was only 15 months old. It was a terrible accident, a chain of events leading to the worst possible outcome. It was probably one of the most horrific calls I've been on. During my time as a search and rescue officer, I've seen few people injured by animal bites, mainly because there aren't many dangerous animals in our park. There are bears in the area, but they tend to stay away from people, and it's very rare to encounter them. Most of the animals you might meet are small, coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. However, we do encounter moose frequently. Let me tell you, moose are nasty creatures. They will chase anyone for no reason, and if you find yourself between a cow and her calf, all you can do is pray. There was one funny call when a guy was chased by a huge bull moose, forcing him to climb a tree. It took us an hour to get him down. When he was back on the ground, he looked at me and said, Damn, those bastards are huge up close. It's not a scary story, but we still laugh when we remember it. Honestly, I don't understand how I could forget to tell this story, but it is undoubtedly the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I guess I tried to forget about it for so long that it didn't come to mind right away. As someone who spends literally all his time in the forest, I try not to even think about fear when I'm alone or somewhere in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you encounter something like this, you just want to forget it all and move on. This is the only case that made me seriously question whether I should continue working in the park. I don't like talking about it, but I'll try to recall all the details. As far as I remember, it happened at the very end of spring. It was a typical missing child case. A 4-year-old girl ran away from her parents' campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were terribly distraught and told us what most parents say in such situations. Our child would never run away from us. She understands perfectly well that she shouldn't go far. She has never done anything like this before. We assured the parents that we would do everything possible to find her and set out to search in standard search formation. I was with one of my good friends, and we were chatting with each other. I know it sounds callous, but you become thick-skinned when you've been on searches for a long time. It becomes normal, and I think you need to learn to become insensitive to keep working in search and rescue. We searched for a good 2 hours, far exceeding the presumed search area. At one point, we passed a small valley, and suddenly something made us both stop synchronously. We froze and looked at each other. It felt like a plane had depressurized. My ears started ringing, and I had a strange feeling that I had fallen from a small height. I began to ask my friend if he felt anything, but before I could say it, we heard the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. It was like a freight train passing right next to us, but the sound was coming from everywhere, even from above and below. My friend shouted something at me, but I couldn't hear anything over this deafening roar. Naturally, we were scared and began to look around for the source of the sound, but we couldn't find anything. Of course, my first thought was a landslide, but there were no elevations nearby. Even if there were, a landslide would have already covered us by then. The sound didn't stop, and we tried to shout to each other, but even standing close by, we couldn't hear anything except this roar. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped, as if someone had pressed a button and just turned it off. We stood absolutely still, and after a second, the normal sounds of the forest began to return. My friend asked me what the hell had just happened. I just shrugged, and we stood there looking at each other for another minute. On the radio, I asked the others if anyone else had heard the sounds of this apocalypse. No one had heard anything, even though we were within shouting distance of each other. We just shrugged and moved on. About an hour later, we checked in with the others again, but no one had found any traces of the girl. Usually we finish searches at dusk, but since there were no traces of the missing child at all this time, many, including us, decided to continue. We stayed close to each other and called her name every few minutes. At that moment, I hoped we would find her. Although I'm not particularly fond of children, the very thought of a girl alone in the dark forest terrified me. Forests can scare a child even during the day, let alone at night. However, we found no traces of her, and no one responded to our calls. Around midnight, we decided to turn back to the group's gathering point. About halfway back, my friend suddenly stopped and pointed his flashlight to the right, towards either a windfall or just a group of fallen trees. I asked him if he had heard a response to our calls, but he just asked me to be quiet and listen. I began to listen and heard a sound resembling a child's cry a short distance from us. We started calling the girl in the hope of a response, but the only answer was that same weak cry. We then moved towards the windfall, circling it, calling her name again and again. When we got close to the source of the sound, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach and told my friend that something was wrong. He replied that he had a similar feeling, but we needed to find out what was going on. We stopped and continued calling the girl, and then we simultaneously realized that the whole time it had been wrong. The crying was looped. A quiet sob, then a cry, then a hiccup, then it repeated, each time the same. Without saying a word, we turned and ran. This was the only time I lost my composure, but something about it was incredibly wrong, and neither of us wanted to stay in that place. When we got back to the gathering point, we asked if anyone had heard anything strange, but no one understood what we were talking about. I know it doesn't sound like a normal ending, but that case threw me off balance for a long time. We never found any trace of the girl. We continue to hope for some information about her disappearance and the disappearances of other people we haven't found, but I doubt we will ever find anything. Out of the missing person cases I've been involved in, only a few ended up with no trace of the person or any clues at all. However, sometimes finding a body only raises more questions. Here are some examples of finding remains that have become notoriously famous in our team. A teenager found almost a year after disappearing. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera about 65 kilometers from the place where he went missing. Unfortunately, the camera was broken. The pelvic bone of an elderly man who went missing a month earlier. That's all we could find. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy were found on the highest peak in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome was found 30 kilometers from where she went missing. She died from exposure 3 weeks after disappearing. All her clothes were intact except for her jacket and shoes. During the autopsy, berries and cooked meat were found in her stomach. The pathologist said it looked like someone had been caring for her. No suspects in the case. The frozen body of a 1-year-old child was found a week after he went missing in a hollow tree trunk, 15 kilometers from where he disappeared. Fresh milk was found in his stomach, but his tongue was missing. The vertebra and right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl were found in the snow almost 30 kilometers from the campsite where her family was last summer. Now let's move on to the stories shared by my friend. At the beginning, I mentioned that you were all interested in the staircases. You're in luck. He has had more contact with them than I have. Although he has no explanation, he has more experience than I do. My friend has been a search and rescue officer for about 7 years. He started while he was still in college. His training was similar to mine when he first saw a staircase in the forest. His mentor told him almost the same thing as mine. Never approach, touch, or climb them. The first time, he did just that. However, it seems his curiosity eventually got the better of him, and during one search operation, he left the group and went to look alone. He told me that it stood about 15 kilometers from where a teenage girl had gone missing. At that moment, the dogs were following the missing girl's trail. He was alone. The main group had stayed behind when he saw the staircase to his left. It looked like it belonged in a new house. The carpet on it was untouched and white. As he approached it, he didn't feel any changes. There were no strange sounds. He thought something should happen, like blood from his ears or shaking, but he stood right in front of the steps and felt nothing. The only thing that seemed strange to him was that there was absolutely no debris on the steps, no dirt, leaves, or dust. There were no signs of animal or insect activity near the staircase either. That also seemed odd to him. It was as if the staircase was just in a relatively barren part of the forest, not that animals and insects were avoiding it. Touching the staircase, my friend felt nothing but the sensation of touching a new carpet. Making sure his radio was working, he began to slowly climb the stairs. He said it was scary because the stairs were described as cursed, and he didn't know what might happen to him. He joked that part of him was waiting to be teleported to another dimension, while another part expected to see a UFO descending from the sky. However, he climbed to the top of the stairs and stood there, looking around. The longer he stood there, the stronger the feeling that something was very wrong became. He described it as feeling like he was in some part of a government facility where he had no access. Like someone was about to arrest him or shoot him in the back of the head at any moment. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew. At that moment, he realized he couldn't hear anything. The sounds of the forest had disappeared, and he couldn't even hear his own breathing. It was like a strange, terrible ringing in his ears, but very oppressive. He climbed down and returned to the search group without telling anyone what he had done. However, the strangest thing happened later. His mentor was waiting for him at the command center after the search ended. He lashed out at him before he could leave. The mentor was furious, and my friend asked what was wrong. "You climbed the steps, didn't you?" It didn't sound like a question. My friend asked how he knew. The mentor just shook his head. "Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost the trail." "What does that have to do with it?" my friend asked. In response, the mentor asked how long he had stood on the stairs. "No more than a minute," my friend replied. The mentor gave him a terrifying dead look and said that if he ever climbed the stairs again, he would be fired. Immediately. After that, he walked away. I think the mentor didn't answer any questions about this story that my friend later tried to ask him. My friend has been involved in many missing person cases where the bodies were never found. I already mentioned David Paulides, and my friend confirmed that his stories are mostly true. He says that if a person is not found immediately after disappearing, they either will never be found or will be found weeks, months, or years later, in a place they simply couldn't have gotten to. One story he told stood out because it involved a 5-year-old boy with a severe mental illness. The little boy disappeared from a picnic in late autumn. In addition to his mental disability, he also had a physical one, and his parents kept repeating that he couldn't have just disappeared. Someone must have taken him. My friend said they searched for him for several weeks, going far beyond the presumed search area, but it seemed the child had simply vanished. The dogs couldn't pick up a scent, even in the clearing where the picnic had taken place, from where the boy apparently disappeared. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was clear they were devastated and had done nothing to their son. The search was called off after about a month, and my friend almost forgot about the case. He was on winter training on one of the peaks when he stumbled upon something in the snow. He saw it from afar, and as he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking out of the snow. Remembering the descriptions, he recognized it as the boy's shirt. About 20 meters from it, he found the child's body, partially covered in snow. My friend said that visually, it looked like the child had been dead for only a few days, even though he had been missing for almost 3 months. The boy was wrapped around something, and when my friend cleared the snow to see what it was, he couldn't believe his eyes. It was a large piece of ice with rough edges, shaped like a human. The boy was holding it so tightly that it had frozen into his hands and chest. My friend radioed the others, and they took the body down the mountain. Based on my friend's account, there was no way the child could have survived alone for almost 3 months, let alone climbed this peak. There was no logical explanation for how he managed to travel almost 80 kilometers and reach this summit. Plus, nothing was found in his stomach or intestines during the autopsy, not even water. It looked like the child had simply disappeared from the face of the earth, was placed in suspended animation, and ended up on this peak several months later, only to die from the cold. The last story he told me happened very recently, just a couple of months ago. In recent months, reports of mountain lion sightings in the park have been coming in, and my friend was involved in searching for them. One of the tasks is to inspect areas of the park where the lions were seen, make sure they are in the area, warn people, and close the trails. He was alone in a rather wooded area at dusk when he suddenly heard a sound in the distance, resembling a woman's scream. As you may know, mountain lion screams sound almost like a woman being tortured. It's disturbing, but not unusual. My friend radioed the others, letting them know he had heard a mountain lion, and said he wanted to see where its territory began. He heard these screams several more times, always from the same place, and using them as a guide, he roughly determined where the mountain lion should be. He was about to head back when he heard the same scream just a few meters from him. Naturally, my friend got scared and started heading back to the gathering point as quickly as possible, because the last thing he wanted was to run into a cursed mountain lion and die. When he got back on the trail and started walking on it, the screams followed him, and then my friend ran. About 1.5 miles from the gathering point, the scream stopped, and he turned to see what had been chasing him. It was already dark, but he could make out something resembling a human silhouette on the trail behind him. He shouted towards the figure that the trails were closed and everyone needed to return to the visitor center. The figure kept standing, and my friend decided to approach it. When he was about 10 meters away, it took what my friend described as an incredibly long step towards him and made the same sound he had heard earlier. Without saying a word, my friend turned and sprinted towards the gathering point without looking back. By the time he got back, the sounds had started moving back into the forest. He didn't tell anyone about this, just reported that there was a mountain lion in the area, and it would be difficult to close all the trails until the animal was found and relocated to the park's closed section. Guys, I am very glad that my stories interest you, and as soon as I return from the training, I will immediately continue to share them.